Hi guys, I'm going to work these problems for you so that hopefully you're ready for your test tomorrow. And I'm going to tell you, if I were you, I would bring my notebook to class tomorrow. Okay, let me share my screen for you. I'm going to just apologize ahead of time because I don't have a stylus, so I have to write with my mouse. So if you're like, hey, what's with your janky handwriting? It's because I don't have a mouse. So let's look at this situation, and I'm going to highlight some important information for us. So first of all, where's my pen? I'm sorry, I'm a big loser. Okay, so we're talking about bug repellent, and it's in February, so generally the demand is low to begin with because in February there's not a lot of bugs. But here comes Zika, and everybody's losing their mind because they're worried they're going to get Zika. So I think the most obvious shift here is Zika's coming. Usually in February, people don't want to buy a lot of bug spray. But what happens in February when Zika comes? So let's make an individual demand curve just for, let's do the demand part first. So we're going to draw a generic. Here's a supply line, and I'm going to label it S1 because it's my first supply line. And then here comes, we'll make it blue. Here comes my demand curve. And again, we're going to label it D1 because it's my first demand curve. So where's my equilibrium point on this graph? The first thing we do before we talk about any sort of shifts is just identify your equilibrium point. So this is my P, my price, 1, and my quantity, 1. So there they are. Now what's going to happen? Zika comes, what happens to my demand? It's going to shift. And so it increases, it shifts this direction. So let's label this new demand curve D2. I don't care about supply problems yet. We're only going to address demand first. So here's demand, and let's draw our new equilibrium point. Here it is. And again, I'm going to drop down and I'm going to drop over. And this point now is price number 2 with my new equilibrium price. And this is quantity 2 with my new quantity. So let's see what happened to price. Well, price increased because here was P1, and then I went up on my price when I get to P2. Price goes up. What happens to quantity? Again, an increase because it goes from Q1 to Q2, and that is another increase. So for the demand side of this problem, we have both an increase in price and an increase in quantity. Let's see where I can make some space. So then what happens? It tells us everyone buys up all the bug spray, but can we increase our supply? No, we cannot increase our supply because it tells us that the companies that produce mosquito repellent, where did it go? Blah, 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 blah. They're scrambling to keep up because their manufacturers in China aren't open. So what happens to supply? The supply decreases. They bought all of it. Can we make more? No. So our supply shifts down. So now let's make it, oh Lord. That went there. I need some more white space. Let's see. So now let's make a new curve. Here it is. And I'm going to, again, make a generic. Here's a supply line, and we're going to label it S1. And then we're going to make a demand curve. And here's my demand curve, D1. What happened to supply? Supply decreased. It shifted this way. So here is S2. Here's my equilibrium point on S1, D1. It's here and it's here. So I'm going to label that price 1 and I'm going to label that quantity 1. Well, what happens on my new shifted supply curve? If I look at my point now, price equilibrium is here. There's price 2. And here's quantity 2. So for this graph, what happened to my price? Well, my price increased again, just like on this one, my price increased. Notice we put the arrow. On this one, price also increased because I went from P1 up here to P2. So price increased. But what about quantity? In this instance, I went from Q1 to Q2, but now I have a decrease. So let's look at our prices and compare them. When I was looking at my demand shift, price increased. When I'm looking at my supply shift, price increased. Those match. So 100% I can say the price is going to increase. But what about quantity? That is where the interesting data comes in. When I look at just the demand shift, the quantity increased. When I look at just the supply shift, the quantity decreased. You have to draw both equilibrium points and then say what happened to price, what happened to quantity. And now, are these conflicting data points? Yes. So that means 100% with this double shifter, price will absolutely increase because it increased for both, but the quantity will be, what's the word? Indeterminate. Because in one situation, the quantity decreased, and in the other situation, the quantity increased. So price increases, quantity is indeterminate. Let's see. Oh, that's a mess. So let's look down here. Use the graph to show the results of a change in demand and supply of insect repellent products. What likely will happen to the equilibrium price? Price will increase, quantity will be indeterminate. Does that make sense to you guys? I hope that it does. Let me see if I can erase all this mess now. Okay, for some of you, that might be all you need. If all you needed was help with the double shifters, congratulations, you're done. The key is draw them out separately, draw the shift in demand, draw the shift in supply, drop the equilibrium, both points, and compare what happened to price and what happened to quantity. But some of you want to talk about these graphs. And so let's talk about them. I'm going to underline some key information in this description. So we have fabulous weather, and that means that orange crops were greatly increased. So right off the bat, I know if I had great weather and the oranges were just growing like gangbusters, what does that do to my supply of oranges? You can see here, originally they drew S1, and then here's the demand, but then supply increased. Why did supply increase? The weather was just absolutely beautiful. So again, all you have to do is drop your equilibrium points. Here's my first equilibrium point. Here's P1, here's quantity 1. When the supply curve shifted to the right to show an increase, what happens? Price dropped for oranges. So a supply increase because of the perfect weather is how we're going to explain this shift. Now let's take this piece of information that there was a price drop in oranges. In the question, they tell us that juice producers equally substitute oranges and grapes. So I don't care if I'm making orange juice or grape juice. If the price for oranges decreases, what does that mean about my ability to produce orange juice? Orange juice becomes cheaper to produce, right? So what happens to my demand for grapes? The price in a substitute good, if the price drops in a substitute, the demand for that other good is going to decrease. Well, I'm not going to buy grapes. I can get oranges for cheaper. Why would I spend money for more expensive grapes? The price for oranges dropped. So the demand for that substitute good of grapes drops. So again, look at your equilibrium points. Quantity decreased and price decreased. So a true statement is that the price of grapes dropped because the demand dropped. Now, what do we do with this information, knowing that the price of grapes decreased? What did they tell us next? What does that do for the market for juice? Wait, I gotta move my mouse. I think I have to erase these things, otherwise it's not gonna make sense when I scroll. All right. Well, if the cost of oranges has decreased, do we care if we're making orange juice or grape juice? No, they didn't care if they were making orange juice or grape juice. So they're going to make orange juice. But the input, the supplies to go into making the orange juice are less expensive. So what does that do to my supply? I'm going to increase it. I'm going to make more of it if I can make it for cheaper. The cost of the input, the oranges decrease, so it's going to increase my supply. So again, compare my equilibrium points. The price for juice what happened to my price? It decreased. Great. Now let's look over at the market for eggs. They told us in the problem to consider eggs and juice as complementary goods, like hamburgers and hamburger buns. They go together. So what is the consequence if the price of a complementary good decreases? I can get juice for cheaper now. What happens to my complementary good of eggs? Well, I'm going to buy more eggs because I can get juice for cheaper. I'm going to increase my demand for eggs. So again, let's look at our two equilibrium points. Here was our original equilibrium. Then I shifted my demand curve and I created a new equilibrium, and I'm going to label them both. Next, what happened to the price of eggs? In this case, the price of eggs increases. How's that going to change things for us? So the price of eggs increases. The explanation for this one was that the price of a complementary juice decreased, therefore demand for eggs, because eggs and juice, apparently, according to these people, go together. So price for eggs increased. What does that do for our next situation, the market for pancakes? Let's erase these guys. Get out of here, Mr. Arrow. So eggs are more expensive. What does that mean about the market for pancakes? They told us to consider eggs are used in the production of pancakes. So if the cost of my materials to produce pancakes is more expensive, the price went up for my materials, my supply is going to decrease because now it's more expensive to produce. So I'm going to supply fewer of them. Again, compare the equilibrium points. Here's Q1 on my new supply curve. Here's Q2, price 1, price 2. What happened to price in this situation? You're fine, you can come in, I'm just talking. So in this one, because the price of eggs increased, my supply for pancakes decreased. What did it do for my price of pancakes? The price increased. So now let's take that information. How does that affect the market for maple syrup? Well, pancakes and maple syrup are much more obvious complementary goods. So if the price of pancakes goes up, are people going to buy as much syrup? No, they're not going to buy as much syrup because pancakes are more expensive. I'm not buying as much maple syrup. So what does that do to my demand? It decreases my demand. It shifts it down. So again, check your equilibrium point. Here was my first equilibrium point, D1, S1. What happens to price? Hold on. Why are you not doing what I told you to do? There it is. What happened to my price? In this instance, the price dropped. Why did the price drop? Because the price of a complementary good, pancakes, increased. So you have to take the information that you get about price from the previous graph and apply knowing what that change in price does to the next situation. Everybody good with that? Let's see. All this is doing is going through the same process again. So I'm going to post this to Canvas, but I think just looking at the answers and looking at the explanation for why it shifted should be good enough for you. If you are still struggling with the double shifter, please send me a Canvas message and I will work one more problem out for you and I'll send it to you. But I think once you guys realize that you have to do the shifts separately and comparing the equilibrium points is the key. And then saying, how did price change? How did quantity change? This is a good example. Let's just pretend like I shifted my supply here. So in this instance, if I looked at my first equilibrium point, Q1, P1, and then I shifted supply, and here's my new equilibrium point, what happened to price? In this one, price increased, and also quantity decreased. But then look at this one. This now is shifting demand. Don't look at any of the other words. We're just taking a hypothetical as if I'm shifting, if I'm doing a double shifter. Here's my original S1, my original D1, and so I drop my equilibrium point here to here. That's not exact, but you get the idea. Then shift the curve. Demand apparently in this situation increased. So here's my new equilibrium point here and here. What happened to price in this situation? I know what happened to price when I shifted supply, price increased. When I shifted demand, what happened to price? Price still increased. But what happened to quantity? Quantity increased. So which one has conflicting data? the quantity is conflicting because in my supply shift, the quantity decreased, but in my demand shift, the quantity increased. So I can say when it says what happens to price and quantity with this double shifter, price for sure increased. Why? Because the price for both supply and demand curves increased. But my quantity is indeterminate because in one instance, quantity decreased, in the other instance, quantity increased. So that's how you can tell what the situation is. Guys, I hope that this cleared up some things for you. If you still have questions, you got to send me a Canvas message. I will help you, but I can't know you need help unless you let me know. All right, how do I end this? I'm going to stop recording. Okay, see you guys tomorrow.